There's no question that the original Final Fantasy VII, released on the Sony PlayStation, is a landmark in gaming history, not only existing as a legendary game, but one that is frequently hailed as one of the finest video games ever created. Despite some smaller successes in the 8 and 16-bit generations, this seminal title cemented the status of turn-based RPGs from Japan as major contenders in Western markets, giving Sony a significant advantage in dominating the 32-bit console era. The game was absolutely huge and underscored the value of multi-disc gaming, offering developers the extensive space required as video game narratives become more complex and expansive. Significantly larger than its predecessor, Final Fantasy VII highlighted the growing need for developers to utilise more storage space. Speaking of which, this was a key factor in the Nintendo 64 lagging behind Sony's optical disc-based console. This was particularly troublesome for Nintendo, given their previous partnership breakdown with the Japanese electronics giant, which had led to the cancellation of the planned PlayStation add-on for the Super Nintendo. However, as impactful as Final Fantasy VII was on the gaming industry, there was a time when it was originally intended not for the PlayStation, not for the Nintendo 64, but instead for the humble Super Nintendo. So with all of that said, let's explore this often overlooked chapter in history and imagine what might have been. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of the very early development of Final Fantasy VII. Yeah! To explore this great chapter in Final Fantasy VII's illustrious past, let's go back to the beginning of the franchise, with the ideal starting point being the very first game. Final Fantasy debuted on the Nintendo Famicom in 1987, with its successor, Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III, released in 1988 and 1990 respectively. In the 21st century, there are several options for playing these original 8-bit games in English. However, initially, only the first game was available in that language, and even then, it was limited to North America. As a result, most of the world didn't experience any Final Fantasy at all during its early years. Role-playing games are widely acclaimed for their extensive dialogue. It's likely that gamers in the late 80s preferred fast-paced arcade-style experiences over the more gradual immersion of RPGs, and the mass consumer market was simply not ready for games of this ilk yet. During this dark age of Japanese role-playing games in the West, interestingly, there was a time when Squaresoft planned and even marketed an American release of Final Fantasy II, subtitled Dark Shadow over Palakia. Speaking of which, a prototype cartridge was even produced. But the translation process lagged, and by the time the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was about to launch, it seemed futile. After all, releasing a fully translated version of a 1988 game seemed less appealing, as the advanced Mode 7 graphics of the SNES were set to captivate players imminently. Similarly, Final Fantasy III was also contemplated for an overseas release, but didn't progress as far in development as its predecessor before the idea was ultimately abandoned too. As times moved on, by 1991 the Super Nintendo was thriving worldwide, and the Japanese game Final Fantasy IV was launched in North America as Final Fantasy II. Squaresoft decided to rename it, believing it would be confusing for players to leap from the first to the fourth installment. The English version was modified, it was censored for religious content and simplified to accommodate an audience potentially unfamiliar with the genre. In response, Japan later saw the release of Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, which incorporated some of these changes to gauge the reaction of the domestic audience. Jumping to the next mainline game in the series, Final Fantasy V was released in Japan in December of 1992, but it was not brought to North American audiences at all back in the day. Subsequently, this would mean that Final Fantasy VI was introduced in North America as Final Fantasy III, continuing the renumbering of titles and leaving players curious about the missing installments, 3, 4 and 5. Now, when we take into consideration that all 6 of these games missed out on European releases, This meant when Final Fantasy VII was a huge hit in my country, I would ponder if the 7 in the name had nothing to do with chronological numbering whatsoever, like say the later hit movie Ocean's 11, unless I missed the 10 prequels to that one at some point too. I have to say, I am so grateful to live in a world where I can now enjoy all the classic Final Fantasy games, even if I was multiple generations late to the party. Gaming is much more accessible than it was in the 90s, even if many titles remain expensive. For this reason, I would like to alert you to the fact that on instantgaming.com you can get absolutely huge discounts on not only loads of games from the iconic Final Fantasy series, but thousands of other games too. Today's sponsor, Instant Gaming, distinguishes itself by offering the opportunity to procure video games at insanely low prices. They are 100% legit, as they get all of their keys directly from the source, offering us authenticity without compromise. Using my link, you can enjoy tons of crazy deals on their website, including nearly every Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy VII for under $5 for example, or the ludicrous 58% off of Remake with all of its DLC included. Happy shopping! Back on the subject of 6, the franchise's high point in the Super Nintendo, in addition to the usual visual and dialogue modifications, Squaresoft encountered the constraints of the cartridge format. The English version required a reduction in text files because of ROM size limitations, whereas Japanese characters, which can convey more information per character than English letters, allowed for more extensive dialogue when the game was released domestically. So, to have accommodated the full scope of the English dialogue, Squaresoft would have needed to increase the cartridge's storage capacity significantly. Tying into our Final Fantasy VII centric story today, when Final Fantasy VI launched in 1994, it coincided closely with the upcoming release of a Sony PlayStation. Although the Super Nintendo continued to support new game releases until 1998, it was evident that the next generation of consoles was gaining momentum. During this transitional period, developers were faced with choices about their future directions. So keeping in mind that the Super Nintendo still had a huge built-in audience around the time of the PlayStation's launch, Squaresoft contemplated developing their next project, Final Fantasy VII, for the Super Famicom again. This meant that no matter what direction the future would ultimately hold, preliminary work on Final Fantasy VII for the Super Nintendo would happen. For evidence of this, following the completion of Final Fantasy VI, creator Hironobu Sakaguchi assumed the role of producer, allowing Yoshinori Kitase, the director of Final Fantasy VI, to spearhead the development of the next installment. Reflecting on this transition in an interview with Polygon, Kitase remarked, "At the time it wasn't clear yet whether Japanese RPGs were going to go 3D or not. Sakaguchi-san was especially fond of pixel art, and we debated a lot about whether we should remain in that 2D style." After we finished Final Fantasy VI, we began working on Final Fantasy VII as a 2D game for the Super Famicom, brainstorming and holding initial planning meetings. I think we had about 60 people in total working on Final Fantasy VI. When we started pre-production for Final Fantasy VII on the Super Famicom, it was probably a little smaller than that, maybe 20 or 30 people. Speaking of this foggy period from the murkiest depths of Final Fantasy VII's past, the Final Fantasy 25th anniversary Ultimania, commemorating the franchise's quarter-century milestone, includes a supporting image from the Super Famicom project. This image, featuring character sprites borrowed from Final Fantasy VI, shows 3 characters in a rustic farmland setting. Although potentially just existing to experiment with art for the game, some theorise that it's possible this scene served as a prologue, or existed before the narrative shifted to a New York-like city, a location that certainly wasn't included in the retail release of the game. That's right, before the dystopian city of Midgar was born. Although let's be fair, they're both shitholes, in its embryonic stages, the game's narrative was markedly different, stemming from an original script penned by Hironobu Sakaguchi himself. In the early drafts of a story, his vision leaned towards a detective-style narrative, a stark contrast to the final iteration. Initially, the plot centered around the character dubbed Detective Joe, a fervent investigator entangled in a pursuit across a fully conceptualized city, chasing protagonists responsible for catastrophic destruction. While Sakaguchi laid down the foundational plot, his focus gradually shifted towards refining the game's battle mechanics, paving the way for others to sculpt the narrative further. Key contributions came from Yoshinori Kitase and Kazushiji Nojima, who enriched the storyline with layers involving the rebel group Avalanche, the corporate colossus Shinra Electric Power Company, and the complex backstories of Cloud Strife and his nemesis Sephiroth. Sakaguchi's initial ideas also touched on the philosophical, particularly about death's nature and impact. He aimed to depict death realistically, moving away from the grandiose sacrificial deaths typical in earlier series entries. This conceptual seed grew into the game's livestream narrative and was poignantly illustrated through Aerith Gameboro's memorable and impactful death scene, which continues to resonate through the storyline even after her passing. A novel idea from Tetsuya Nomura, which diverged from series traditions, proposed a dynamic where players would actively pursue the antagonist Sephiroth. This concept of a moving target was new to Final Fantasy and was designed to add momentum and continuity to the narrative's progression. During the script's development, discussions floated the drastic possibility of killing off most of the game's cast, leaving only a few survivors. This idea was championed by Kitase, but was ultimately shelved as Nomura felt that such a mass extinction would undermine the significance of Aerith's singular death. Thus, the decision was cemented to focus the narrative's weight on Aerith's demise, with Nojima crafting the poignant scene that would mark a defining moment in gaming's history. Going back to the Super Nintendo screenshot, the setting isn't overtly archaic, but it does seem slightly disconnected from the final version of the project. More likely, this image represents early graphical experimentation by the artists, rather than a depiction of a specifically planned location. During the time period that Final Fantasy VII was being developed as a Super Nintendo game, development on another Square RPG for the platform was not going as smoothly as planned. You see, Chrono Trigger's development was in dire straits, so all the team members temporarily stopped work on Final Fantasy VII and switched over to help with Chrono Trigger. Sakaguchi supports this viewpoint, adding that before we made Chrono Trigger, we had talked about making Final Fantasy VII, but then we moved everyone over to the Chrono Trigger team. I do recall now, I did write a scenario for Final Fantasy VII, a different story than the one we eventually used. I don't remember it being in New York though. You know, I think the New York idea might be from Parasite Eve. And Joe? That's actually the original name I had for the protagonist from Lost Odyssey. I don't know, maybe all this information is getting mixed up somewhere. It's intriguing that even those who lived through this era don't have a complete recollection of what transpired regarding the development of Final Fantasy VII for the Super Nintendo, which only further goes to show how hazy the picture of this period is. While Square, now Square Enix, remained somewhat secretive about their endeavours in the 90s, between those involved there seems to be confusion as well. The blurring of the lines between the creation of different games and the detective-based Final Fantasy VII suggests that, perhaps, this concept could have potentially been repurposed for Parasite Eve on the PlayStation, pitting the protagonist against a sorceress and exploring a central theme of life throughout the game's production. No matter what though, whether set in New York City or in the iconic location of Midgar, Final Fantasy VII was poised to offer a fresh and contemporary take on the RPG genre. Ideas from the original concept, particularly those deemed valuable, were shared among Chrono Trigger, Parasite Eve and Final Fantasy VII. In the Sony PlayStation era, Square continued to produce several memorable titles for the Super Famicom. Their lineup from 1995 to 1997 included notable games such as Front Mission, Chrono Trigger, Seiken Densetsu 3, Romancing Saga 3, Bahamut Lagoon and Super Mario RPG. So Final Fantasy VII for such a system wouldn't have been strange at all. In fact, retrospectively, it would have been a sensible and conservative option and far less of a gamble to produce than the ambitious title we received on PlayStation hardware. Speaking of the Super Nintendo in the late 90s, Square's production on the platform concluded with Treasure of the Rudrous as the last game developed, and Treasure Hunter G marked the final game published for the aging 16-bit console. Following their 2D ventures on the platform, Squaresoft famously began exploring 3D technology for upcoming consoles. During this period, there was widespread speculation that Final Fantasy VII would debut on the Nintendo 64 instead of the PlayStation. However, ultimately, the extensive disk-based storage offered by the PlayStation proved irresistible, pulling Square away from Nintendo for the long term. The Final Fantasy VII we received was indeed spectacular, and one of my favourite games ever made. However, one cannot stop themselves from whimsically imagining what this title would have been like if we had have ended up getting it on the Super Nintendo like initially intended. Don't forget you can get huge discounts on loads of Final Fantasy games and more by using my Instant Gaming affiliate link now. And if you want more quirky history on this game, check out my upload on the full Chinese remake that was created for the NES. Cheerio!